So Napoleon is with the French army in Egypt, and they inflict a series of decisive defeats upon the Ottoman Turks and conquer Egypt. But the British have taken Minorca and Malta, and these Austrian and Russian armies are marching into Central Europe. Under Nelson, the Royal Navy smashes the French fleet at the Battle of the River Nile. And so now Napoleon's victorious French army is stuck in Egypt. He tries to then drive through into the Middle East, gets bogged down in the Levant. In the end, Napoleon will abandon his army in the Middle East and France and slip back to France, leaving his men out there to face the British and the Turks. Austrian and Russian troops win a series of victories in Switzerland. It looks like the French are losing the war, but a joint British-Russian expedition to the Netherlands fails, and the French army smashes the Italian state of Naples before roundly beating the Russians in Switzerland. The Russians are forced to negotiate a peace, leaving the Austrians alone, and the Austrians then face the French at the Battle of Marengo, and the French armies hammer the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo, leading in 1801 Austria to surrender. For when Napoleon slipped back from Egypt to France in 1799, he seized control and turned the revolutionary republic into a military autocracy, a military dictatorship. And under Napoleon, France has been energised to try and beat its opponents and has now knocked Russia and Austria out of the war. Meanwhile, in 1801, the French ally Spain conquers Portugal. As it happens, the Portuguese monarchy flee Portugal and take over Brazil, which is a Portuguese colony, and will now become the monarchy of Brazil. The monarchy actually abandons Portugal for a time. Meanwhile, however, Prussia and Denmark conquer the North German state of Hanover, that had been so closely linked to Britain, for the British monarchy had been the Hanoverian monarchy as well. Britain is now left alone, however. Her allies, Austria and Russia, have been knocked out of the war. Portugal has been conquered. Naples has been conquered. The Ottoman Turks beaten. And so the War of the Second Coalition has gone disastrously for the British, and once again the British are left alone, fighting against the French, the Dutch and the Spanish. Now Russia, Denmark, Sweden and Prussia sign a defensive alliance, and they say that they'll go to war with whoever attacks them. And under pressure from France, however, significant diplomatic pressure, they act to keep out British trade from the Baltic. The French idea is this: they will starve Britain out economically. The British are blockading Europe, and Europe says, well, we won't buy Britain's industrial goods, and we'll see who takes the economic damage. The British, fearing that Europe is starting to unite against them, start to take action against European fleets, and Nelson destroys the Danish fleet of Copenhagen in port. Famously, he's told, his orders are, don't attack Copenhagen if you see the Danish fleet, which is substantial. Now, he'd already been wounded in action before and could only see light or dark out of one eye. Famously, he put the telescope to his injured eye and said, I see no ships, and sailed into Copenhagen harbour, breaking the orders. Remember, his orders were not to attack Copenhagen if you see the Danish fleet, which is why I see no ships, because he put it against his injured eye, claimed he didn't know the Danish fleet was there, and attacked Copenhagen, devastating Copenhagen and destroying the Danish fleet, which was a bit of a shock to the Danes, who were unaware that they were going to be attacked by the British. They weren't aware they were at war, but it certainly stopped those ships from being used against the British. A British army also won at the Battle of Alexandria against the French. I come from Gloucester initially, and the Gloucester Regiment are allowed badges on the front and back of their caps to remember the time that British soldiers fought back to back at Alexandria to fight off French cavalry. And with the victory at Alexandria, the British army drive the French out of Egypt. The British are also victorious in their fighting in India against the Indian army led by Tipu Sultan. And the British general leading this army is a man called Arthur Wellesley, the man who will become the Duke of Wellington, but is not yet. So the British complete their seizure of the French, Dutch, Danish and Swedish empires in the West Indies in 1801. And in 1802, Britain and France finally sign a peace at Amiens. The British have been victorious at sea, in Egypt, and around the world, but the French control the continent of Europe. But even after the peace treaty of 1802, the French continue economic warfare against the British, and the French use this time to rearm and to attack British interests in the West Indies, Italy, and India. And so the peace is only really a pause for breath between the clash of these two great powers for who will be the dominant force of Europe. And in 1803, Britain and France go to war again. And again, the British rapidly overrun the French Empire around the globe that had been returned with the start of peace. In 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France, and Spain declares war on Britain too. It's the war of the Third Coalition, as Austria, Russia, and Sweden are persuaded to rejoin the war with British money. And so you now have an alliance of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden fighting against France and Spain. In 1805, you have the Battle of Trafalgar. The French try and invade, with their Spanish allies, try to invade Britain. At Trafalgar, the Spanish and French fleets are sailing to pick up the Grand Army of France to cross the Channel. It looks like it might, if they can land, they are likely to succeed, but at Trafalgar, Nelson destroys the French and Spanish fleets, saving Britain from invasion at the cost of his own life, and ensuring that the British control the sea lanes and are safe from invasion. But despite this great victory, at the same time, on land, the French under Napoleon win a series of stunning victories. First at Ulm against the Austrians, and then at Austerlitz against an Austrian and Russian army. And Austria is forced to surrender after its army is hammered, and they're forced to surrender at Pressburg. As part of the terms of the peace treaty, the Habsburgs have to declare the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire. This old medieval relic, created by Charlemagne, is destroyed in 1805. In 1806, the Prussians declare war on France to try and preserve their superiority in Germany, but it's smashed in just a single month at the Battle of Jena, and soon is brought into the French Napoleonic Empire, what they call the continental system, where nations are banned from trading with Britain. In 1807, the Russians, seeing Europe now underneath French control, Russia tries to send its armies to free Europe from French control, but it's beaten at the Battle of Friedland, and Prussia and Russia surrender at Tilsit to the French. Russia is forced to join in the anti-British blockade, and Prussia is made a satellite state of the French, much like the Dutch and Spanish are. The French are now masters of a united Europe, united under the Emperor Napoleon and its continental system. In 1808, France invades Spain. Now that's going to sound odd, because Spain's on its side. But Napoleon decides that the Spanish need to be ruled by his own brother. And so he declares war on the Spanish to put Napoleon's brother on the throne. He'd already done something similar to the Dutch. He decided that his family had to be kings of all of Europe. And so the Spanish, to their shock, are invaded by the French. The British send troops to help Spain and Portugal resist domination by the French. It turns out to be a long, bloody conflict, a running sore on France, of constant guerrilla warfare by the Spanish and Portuguese. For France, it is their Vietnam. The war hinges ultimately on economics. It's British industry against French plunder. The British try to turn to finance and banking to fund this war. The French try to loot all of Europe and turn it into their own cash cow. The French industry is being ground down by the British blockade. The British are also effectively smuggling goods into Europe, ignoring and bypassing the continental system that's meant to keep British goods out. And in particular, British industry starts to turn to Africa, Asia, and South America as new markets for their industrial products. And so despite the war and despite being banned from trading with Europe, British exports actually increase year on year. In 1794-6, they exported £21.7 million worth of goods, nearly doubling to £44.4 million worth of goods from 1814 to 16, as Britain starts to trade globally instead of with Europe, a Europe which is starved of British industrial goods.